Taylor Wanaki, hello, it's good to see everybody. Just want to acknowledge the indigenous people of the land, the Tongva Gebrenos. So I don't know if there's anybody from that nation that's here in the audience, but I want to acknowledge them. I am an adjunct professor at California State University at Puvungna. Puvungna means place of gathering in the Tongva language, and there's actually 22 remaining acres of the village site of Puvungna. It is the birthplace of the Tongva and surrounding Californian indigenous nations religion. And so there are 22 remaining acres located at the Cal State Long Beach site. So I always acknowledge the places that I visit and the places where I live at, because as indigenous peoples, we're place-based peoples. We're a living paradox to most Americans and their lifestyle, and I'll talk a little bit about that. I was asked to give a title, so I called it The Sustaining Disorder of Predatory Capitalism in Any Country. But the reality is that it's much more. It's more disorder. It's more than just capitalism. It's a system that sustains the process of genocide, and that's serious. It might not sound that serious to a lot of folks. I've interviewed several elders in medicine people over the last couple of years, and we talk in different cultures. It has a different meaning about 7 generations, and that's one interpretation is to understand where you are today. You have to look back 7 generations. And when you take into consideration your actions of today, you have to consider how your actions today will impact 7 generations into the future. And so it's an important concept culturally for us. And a couple of folks I've interviewed over the last couple of years, they've told us that we as indigenous peoples and our respective First Nations within the politically defined borders of the United States, at least, that we will not be here 7 generations from now. That the process of American colonialism, material capitalism or predatory capitalism, however you want to characterize it, and the systemic racism that continues to exist in almost every manner and facet of American society is not only killing us, but killing the land and everything that the land provides for us culturally as indigenous peoples. And so that is, I've been told that by several people over the last couple of years, and perhaps the most positive thing I've heard someone say is that this generation right now will define our existence. And so that's the spectrum in terms of our existence as indigenous peoples and our respective First Nations. So I was, asked to talk about the causes, the consequences, and some of the remedies or suggestions. I mean, I could talk about colonization and genocide for hours. But some of the things that I will highlight as indigenous peoples, we are the only population group as nations that have an extra constitutional relationship with the U.S. federal government. We are the only peoples that are specifically mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. As indigenous peoples today, there are about 566 federally recognized indigenous nations that are recognized either through signed and ratified treaties, congressional act, or a presidential executive order. There are also about 400 indigenous nations that are not federally recognized. So if you do the math, 400 and 566, you have about 966 indigenous nations within the politically defined borders of the United States. And each indigenous nation is culturally different. And indigenous nations vary in population size. So I'm Lumbee. Lumbees are the largest indigenous nation east of the Mississippi. There's about 58,000 of us. And believe it or not, for indigenous populations, that's actually large. I think we're the 9th largest indigenous nation within the United States. It's either the Dene or Navajo, and then the Cherokees. They tend to switch off about every decade, according to the U.S. Census. So we're small as nations, and I use the term nations instead of tribes because tribes is actually, if you look at the etymology of the word tribe, it comes from the word tribus, and it referred to the conquered, uncivilized people that lived outside the city during the Roman period. So the concept, or the English word nation, is probably the closest cultural concept that matches. And one of the things with the English language and indigenous concepts, they're not a uniform fit. You know, at best you can get a ball, right, and stick it in a square hole and hope that the square hole is big enough. It's never a uniform flush fit. So when we talk about causes of colonization, I'll just talk briefly about, I mentioned theological, monarchical, and state-sponsored terrorism. And that's important when we talk about theology, because theology is just not a religious belief, it's a political belief and a political system. And I mention that because the justification for the dispossession of Indigenous peoples in the respective First Nations lands is the two papal bulls that were issued by the Vatican, first in 1452 and in 1493. And it basically, the Vatican gives European colonial explorers to discover originally pre-1492 the lands throughout the continent of Africa and lay claim to those lands because they are non-Christians. And then in 1493 you have the second papal bull that was issued that allowed colonists to lay claims to Indigenous peoples' lands here in the Western Hemisphere on the pretext that we were non-practicing Christians, yet salvageable Christians. And those two papal bulls are important because in a court case in 1821, Johnson v. McIntosh, Justice Supreme Court Marshall was trying to come up with a justification for the dispossession of Indigenous peoples' lands. And through his rational justification for dispossessing Indigenous peoples of their lands, he cited the doctrine of discovery and the doctrine of conquest. And in that court case, and I'm paraphrasing, but you'll get the message that the legal justification for the dispossession of Indigenous peoples' lands was that our ancestors got civilization in Christianity. And Johnson v. McIntosh is one of three Marshall Trilogy cases that is cited in every U.S. Supreme Court case today. And federal Indian law is the largest body of law in the U.S. Jurisprudence system. There's over 5,000 court cases directly and indirectly related to Indigenous peoples and their respective First Nations. So America has a long theological history of imposing forms of fascism or terrorism, and it's still maintained today through the U.S. Legal system. Treaty violations, I mentioned that for federally recognized Indigenous nations, there's approximately 380 380 treaties that were signed and ratified, right? And everybody knows that treaties are only valid if they're ratified. There's an equal number of treaties that were signed with Indigenous nations but never ratified. So treaty violations are important because there's three components that the federal government is obligated to as part of its trust responsibility with Indigenous nations, and that is to provide forms of health care, economic development, and education. Of course, they're based on Western constructs of economic development, health care, and education, and Indigenous traditional notions of those three comments. The Wetiko psychosis is an Indigenous concept. It's pronounced in different languages slightly different. Wetiko, Wintiko, Windigo psychosis. And it's this cultural concept that Indigenous people have of people engaged in this process of cannibalization, right? And cannibalizing means everything that Mother Earth provides for us. So cannibalizing the land, cannibalizing the two-legged, cannibalizing the four-legged, cannibalizing the sea and the animal relations, cannibalizing other human beings that are different. So we call that the Wetiko psychosis, and I would argue that capitalism reflects this pathology, this Indigenous pathology of the Wetiko psychosis. And the U.S. government today continues to maintain policies of assimilation because we are different. And from the U.S. Government's perspective, the idea is always to imagine us based on their ethno and Eurocentric constructs. And that has been the premise of our existence, is trying to, as Floyd Red Crow Westerman would say, we are trying not to become cultural roadkill in manifest destiny. And so, and we are at that juncture this time in Western history. So, forced removal, land allotments, urbanization. Indigenous people have their own cultural concepts of urbanization. I don't need to give a history lesson on forced removal. Most indigenous peoples within the politically defined borders of the United States live away from their traditional homelands. About 2/3 of us live in urban environments. About 10 to 12% of us live on border towns adjacent to our traditional homelands, and about 20 to 25% of us still live within our traditional homelands. So we're very decentralized. We're about 1.5% of the entire U.S. population. So if you take 1.5% of the entire U.S. population, that's about 5.2 million indigenous peoples. That's according to the 2010 U.S. Census. So small numbers, highly decentralized, and most Americans don't know or know very little about who we are. In fact, an indigenous student at the University of Pennsylvania, she spent 2 years going through the high school textbooks used in America's public school system, and what she found, or what she discovered in going through all the history textbooks, is that in 83% of those history textbooks, indigenous peoples were not mentioned after the year 1900. Okay? Only one state used a history textbook that talked about one indigenous person in the present tense living, and that state was New Mexico. 3 states had history textbooks that actually mentioned the boarding school system. And if anybody knows about the boarding school system, that was mandatory, compulsory, forced assimilation through America's school systems. They were institutions for assimilation, to Christianize indigenous youth, to de-indigenize us. Right? A lot of us were given names, or when youth, anywhere from the ages of 6 to 16, were taken from their parents and forced to go to these boarding schools. They were given European names, and hence a lot of indigenous people have European names, and it comes from that era, the boarding school era from 1879, really up until 1933. So in America, we're not part of America's consciousness in almost every facet. And I always get, when somebody puts up a chart, right, of all the demographics, I always look to see if, quote unquote, Native Americans are even mentioned, right? So if we are mentioned, we're lumped together, lumped as one homogenized ethnic group, which is not true, right? Whatever nation we're from would be our ethnic group. So I always describe indigenous peoples as plurinational and pluricultural peoples, and not just one homogenized ethnic group as a subgroup within the United States. Economic impositions. I'd like to talk specifically about the resource extractive industry, because the electricity that Southern Californians get comes predominantly from the coal, from the Dene and Hopi nations, and they have endured a legacy of forced relocation, beginning with John McCain, who I'd probably argue in a contemporary sense is the late 20th century and even 21st century Indian killer. And I'll say that in a cultural context. John McCain sponsored the Dene Hopi or Navajo Hopi Land Settlement Dispute Act in 1974 that resulted in approximately 7,000 to 10,000 traditional Dene or Navajo people being forcefully relocated from their traditional homelands. And a lot of those families, when they were relocated to border towns. They were given half-acre lots and 10 sheep. and it's estimated anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 traditional Dene or Navajo folks died because of the cultural shock and the cultural transition of forced relocation. And that was John McCain working, I guess, complicitly with the resource extractive industry, such as Peabody Coal Corporation. And I mentioned John McCain in the 21st century because, as you know, every year Congress passes the National Defense Authorization Act. And just before Congress passed the National Defense Authorization Act of 2015, John McCain slipped a rider into the NDAA that essentially gave a Rio Tinto subsidiary corporation called Resolution Copper 2,200 acres of a sacred site known as Oak Flat. And if you don't know where Oak Flats is, if you've been to Phoenix and you drive east about an hour and head out to the Tonto National Forest, there's a campground called Oak Flat, and that is a sacred site for all 7 bands of the Apache Nation. And John McCain slipped this rider into the NDA, essentially giving this entire sacred site over to a resource extractive company. In fact, Rio Tinto has some of the worst human rights records out of any resource extractive company throughout the world. And so there is a spiritual camp that, that maintains an encampment there since the second week of February in protests, spiritually in protests, engaging in ceremony until there is some type of outcome. And what that outcome is yet, I am not sure, but that area has the largest, one of the largest beds of copper underneath Mother Earth in the United States, for the same reasons that the Dene and Hopi nations in Arizona, but in New Mexico, they also live on top, or lived on top of, the largest bed of low sulfur bituminous coal, which was strip mined. The water underground was pumped out. Over 3 million gallons of water was pumped out a day to mix in with the coal to create a coal slurry to ship over to the Mojave generating plant to produce electricity. And anywhere from 3 to 5% of that electricity that came out of that plant is the electricity that residents in Los Angeles County have been using since the late 1970s. For indigenous peoples that are federally recognized, the U.S. government deemed a long time ago that we had the right to occupy our lands, but we don't have the right to own our lands, in large part because we weren't human Christians like them. And therefore, indigenous people occupy the lands. And so what that means when it comes to resource extractive industries, they negotiate leasing contracts with the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And a lot of companies, such as Peabody Coal Company, have 99-year lease agreements with the federal government. So Peabody Coal has been operating in the Dene or Navajo Nation since the 1930s, and they have a 99-year contract to maintain operations there. Resource extractive companies utilize the 1872 Surface Mining Act law, which allows them essentially to have access to land for free. They do have to pay royalties to indigenous nations for those resources that are extracted, but they're at the 1872 rate, right? Not the industry rate. So just for clarification. And in the United States, when we talk about indigenous peoples, the current administration and even the previous administration and all previous administrations beforehand maintain what's called a forced federalism model. In other words, if you're federally recognized, we'll at least talk to you, at least with the Obama administration. The Bush administration ignored us. But with the Obama administration, at least we get to talk. And in some cases, a little bit of money. But money's not the same thing as land. And when you're a place-based people and your entire culture is based on the land and the language and your traditions, when you don't have the land, it's hard to maintain your traditions. It's hard to live in accordance to your traditional ways of life. So if you're federally recognized, right, then the U.S. government talks to you. If you're a state-recognized nation, then you have some channels at the state level. If you're not state or federally recognized, you don't exist, right? And there are thousands and thousands of Indigenous peoples and their respective First Nations that have lived their entire existence and have never been recognized by either state or federal government. So for us, our sacred lands are always under attack. Our sacred sites are always under attack, predominantly by the resource extractive industry. So in Northern California, Mount Shasta, they want to build a giant geothermal plant. Members of the Paiute and surrounding Indigenous nations in Northern California were just in court a few weeks ago. This is part of a court case that's been going on for over 6 years. Out near Blythe, right? Since there's lots of talk about the green economy and the development of renewable resources, especially solar. The solar industry wants to build solar farms and destroy on top of sacred sites. So up in Northern California, along the Los Angeles water duct, there's attempts to build a giant solar farm on top of a sacred site. Out in the Blythe area, there's attempts to build a giant solar farm on giant geoglyphs that are sacred to California Indigenous river nations. Right now. In terms of consequences judicially, I mentioned there's over 5,000 court cases related to Indigenous peoples. Just to give you some kind of context, the Native American Rights Fund, which is the longest running Indigenous rights organization, founded, I believe, in 1972, and the National Congress of American Indians, which was founded in 1944, is the longest running Indigenous nation that represents federally recognized nations, issued a joint statement in October of 2013 encouraging all Indigenous peoples and their respective First Nations to stay out of the judicial system. And the reason why is that we've lost over 80% of our court cases since the early 1970s. So the two largest Indigenous nations have basically stated, stay out. The body of branch of government that you're supposed to go to for justice, right, means no justice for Indigenous peoples. They issued that statement a month later after a U.S. Supreme Court case called Onondaga versus New York State. And in that court case, the Onondagas went to court suing New York State, showing that the state had illegally taken Onondaga's lands in violation of the 1755 treaty. Those lands, they were taken, the title was transferred to federal agencies. Federal agencies constantly transfer title of Indigenous lands that allows them to circumvent federal law. And of course, if the title is held by the Department of Defense, you can do whatever you want under national security because there's no standard for what constitutes as national security. And so the Onondagas went to court asking for their stolen lands to be returned, clearly demonstrating that the government had violated the treaty. The lands, mind you, are a designated EPA toxic Superfund site. In fact, about 25% of all EPA toxic Superfund sites are either in or adjacent to Indian country. There's about 1,200, if I recall correctly, of EPA designated toxic Superfund sites. And the courts, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a decision, and they said, no, you may not have the land back, even though you've proven it, right, that we were guilty. They didn't quite say that. But the reason for saying no, that you can't have your lands back, is that, quote unquote, it would disrupt settler property law, right? And that is a 2013 U.S. Supreme Court case. And so the branch of government that is supposed to provide a forum for justice is a forum or is a branch of government that acts in complicity with the congressional and the executive to reinforce forms of genocide, I would argue, against Indigenous peoples. How am I doing on time? So, what's that? All right. So when we talk about, since I was asked to talk about poverty, there's always different dimensions of poverty. There's economic poverty. I would argue there's cultural poverty. When we talk about Indigenous peoples and their respective First Nations, I mentioned in the United States, under this system of material or predatory capitalism, we have the dehumanization of all life. There's a couple reports that have come out in the last 6 months. One is, I believe, Nature's Life Report, and basically what it said is that in the last 40 years, the world has destroyed 52% of the world's biodiversity. And for Indigenous peoples, when there's a loss of biodiversity, there's a loss of culture, right? There's a loss of life. These are our relatives. If they're no longer around, then that aspect of the culture no longer exists, right? In terms of consumerism, right? America is a material consumer-based society. And there was another report that came out that said Americans, 60% of the foods that are produced from the industrialized food system in the United States is thrown away, right? 60% of the food that gets produced in the United States is thrown away. So think about California. We're in a 4-year drought, right? We have a year left before the water reserves are completely exhausted, right? Jerry Brown supported Proposition 1, as well as a recent congressional legislation for $1 million to deal with California's water issues, but 80% of the water goes to California's agricultural industry, right? And you'll notice from at the state level, the narrative that you hear is for Californians to keep conserving water. Californians keep conserving water. California citizens should be conserving water, right? But protecting, right, California's industrialized agricultural industry, right? So Americans have their almond milk, which is probably the most water-intensive crops that is harvested within the state of California. So I mentioned material capitalism is the bane of Mother Earth, and the loss of diversity is tantamount. The loss of biodiversity is tantamount to the loss of cultural diversity. And going back to the resource extractive industry, about 30% of the coal, 50% of the uranium, and 20% of the natural gas reserves are quote-unquote within Indian country. And that has a valuation of about $1.5 trillion. Uranium, the uranium industry has been operating in Indian country since the early 1930s as well, which is pretty profound because in 2013, the Indian Health Services, for the first time, just started to monitor the health effects of Indigenous peoples working in the uranium mines in the 1950s and the health effects of Indigenous peoples living next to uranium mines. And I was actually, I was in Cameron last summer, just east of the Grand Canyon, and I went to the local chapter house, and as my first time there, and I said, well, can we go look at some uranium mines so I have a better first-hand perspective on how people live. And he just pointed out the window what looked like these tiny little mesas all around the entire community, right outside the office, the chapter house office. And he goes, oh, those are capped uranium mines. And the closest one was about 100 feet away from the building we were in. So we went out and we walked on top of one, and I asked him, one of the local reps, I said, well, if he had a Geiger counter, I said, what would be the reading? He said, you wouldn't be able to read it. So he said, you wouldn't be able to read the radiation levels, right? And there was all kinds of capped uranium mines throughout the community of Cameron. And that continues to go on. Today, people in the Navajo Nation live around these uranium mines. And the Indian Health Service has just started, right, in 2013, tracking the health effects Dene or Navajo folks that live near or adjacent to uranium mine have some of the highest rates of cancer and leukemia, et cetera, et cetera. So Andy talked a little bit about income inequality. This is from the Oxfam report in terms of global wealth inequality. By 2016, 1% of the world's population will own more wealth than the other 99%, right? And that's pretty profound if you think about wealth inequity, right? And in the United States, right, we have economic dynasties, right? So 6 of today's 10 wealthiest Americans are heirs to the prominent fortunes, and the Walmart heirs alone have more wealth than the bottom 40% of Americans combined, which is pretty profound. And I'm going to skip over this because Andy talked about productivity rates going up, salaries or income going down. So remedies. I think mandatory Indigenous classes are required, so Americans have some sense of who we are and what America's relationship is with us as Indigenous peoples. Treaties should be honored in their entirety. Not one treaty has ever been honored in the history of the United States. We should allow for Indigenous nations to make their own choices. No two sovereign countries are identical to each other, and therefore we should respect Indigenous peoples' sovereignties. Respecting all life, sacred sites. He talked about urbanization. I think we should criminalize the business practices of externalities, corporations that benefit from using public resources that create products that Americans consume. Should not be allowed to let Americans be responsible for the environmental destruction that these corporations cause in the production process of consumer products. Inversions, corporations should not be able to create subsidiaries, hide their wealth offshores. Oh, and by the way, since we're here, right, Microsoft and Pitzer are just some of the major culprits along with Google. Repatriate tax haven accounts. Stop patent trolling. It's one reason why Google bought Motorola, is to own all the patents. I actually think marketing expenses for major corporations should be legal. Too much Americans subsidize corporations marketing to American citizens for propaganda purposes to keep consuming and exploiting the world's resources. So I know I'm running out of time. Apply the Sherman Antitrust Acts to any industry that's monopolized, right? Dissolve corporations' articles of incorporations. You can pass state referendums that mandate that the state's attorney generals dissolve a corporation's article of incorporations. So companies like Peabody that have a long trajectory of committing acts of genocide, right, do not deserve to exist and continue to perpetuate forms of genocide. And I'll leave it at that. So